It was February 14th, 1981, Valentine's Day. The weather was mild for that time of year, and 12-year-old Todd Dombrowski was playing in his grandmother's backyard at the base of an old ash tree on South Locust Avenue in Centralia, Pennsylvania, when the ground underneath him suddenly opened up, dropping young Todd into a hole that was 4 feet wide and 150 feet deep. Luckily, Todd clutched onto the root of the ash tree and was able to hang on, dangling over a pit that was emitting enough heat and toxic carbon monoxide fumes to kill him, until finally his 16-year-old cousin Eric rushed over and pulled Todd to safety. This hadn't been the first time a sinkhole had appeared out of nowhere in Centralia. Years of mining, both legal and illegal, had left abandoned pockets under the earth, and the fire that had been raging beneath the town for decades had hollowed out the ground in areas. But to know that young and innocent Todd Dombrowski had been an inch from death was the wake-up call that most people needed. Later, Todd recalled what it felt like as he fell suddenly into the earth, as the steam and fumes from the mine shaft billowed around him, making it hard to yell for help or even to breathe. Todd described hearing a strange whooshing sound like wind, and every time he heard the whooshing of this wind, the ground beneath him continued to crumble and fall away further. What he was hearing was the hungry mine fire raging beneath him, greedily sucking in as much oxygen as it could, with no thought for the little boy who dangled helplessly above. In a 2002 interview, Todd said, quote, "The last thing in my mind was breathing any of those noxious fumes because we grew up around that. That town was leaking that gray, smelly, noxious gas for as long as I can remember. But just the way the earth was, and no matter what way I struggled, I wasn't really getting anywhere. There's no angels, no life flashing before your eyes. I knew I was going. There was no doubt." End quote. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me for another strange and unusual video. And today we are continuing with the story of Centralia, Pennsylvania, and the fire that has been blazing underneath it since 1962. This fire began on the outskirts of town near the Oddfellow Cemetery, but within no time it had reached the southern edge of Centralia. And at first, the town's residents thought it was kind of interesting, kind of cool.
Even at night now, there's nothing visible, but at one time, a couple years ago when you'd come up here, you could actually see the ground glowing either, red from the fire or sometimes blue. And blue would be from the methane gas burning off. It was kind of wild looking at night, when you see these blue flames coming up out of the hillside.
They thought that they could live with it, especially since many of them no longer had to shovel snow in the winter.
On the south ridge of town, where the fire burns, there is a pungent smell of sulfur in the air. Clouds of steam put a gray filter on the bright sun. In winter, Centralia is a world of fire and ice. The air can be bitterly cold, and the ground hotter than a sauna.
But then people started passing out in their beds from carbon monoxide leaking in through their basements, and steam could be seen spurting through cracks in the pavement. If you have not seen part 1 of this series yet, I have linked in the description box, and you should watch that first because 1 always comes before 2. But before we continue on with today's video, let's have a word from our sponsor, Surfshark VPN. We like talking about strange and unusual topics on this channel, but we don't really want that many strange and unusual things happening in our real lives. Humans need to feel safe and comfortable in order to flourish, and luckily, Surfshark VPN helps keep you protected on the internet so you can enjoy all that the World Wide Web has to offer with an unburdened mind and an open heart. Surfshark VPN secures your data with industry-leading measures by using uncrackable encryption and the most secure secure VPN protocols. And Surfshark also provides IP and DNS leak protection so that nobody can figure out where you're connecting from. I also love that, unlike my internet service provider, Surfshark VPN has a strict no logs policy. That means they aren't watching and recording what you're doing on the internet because you're a grown-up and it's none of their business. So what can you do better on the internet with Surfshark VPN? Well, a lot. You can overcome location price-based discrimination on travel expenses like plane tickets and rental cars. If you're traveling internationally, you can log into a server in your home country when you access your bank account so that your bank account doesn't lock you out or freeze your account for security purposes because they see you're signing in from a different country. You can also feel safe on public Wi-Fi, which is never a sentence I thought I would say, because Surfshark encrypts your data and makes it impossible to steal. And you can easily and quickly get around censorship and geo-blocking. So all that information that you want out there, it's available, not just what they want you to see, depending on where you live, what country you live in, etc., etc. On top of all of that, with Surfshark VPN, you can unlock 15 of the largest Netflix country libraries, including the US and Japan, simply by connecting to a server in that country. And at this time, Surfshark has reached the coverage of 100 countries, and they're the only VPN to do so at this point, which is pretty great. Surfshark has an app for every platform, whether it's PC, Mac, Linux, Android, iOS, smart TVs, Amazon Fire Stick, Apple TV, Chrome, Firefox, Xbox, and PlayStation. One subscription allows you to install and run Surfshark on an unlimited number of devices at once. And when I say unlimited, I mean truly unlimited, okay? Your phone, your partner's phone, your kids' phones, your kids' tablets, your tablet, your mom's PC, all of your kids like Xboxes and PS5s and everybody, all of your loved ones that you want to make sure are also protected on the internet can take advantage of your Surfshark subscription. And that's really a lot of value. There is so much value in Surfshark VPN, and they think you'll agree as well, which is why they're giving you a 30-day money-back guarantee. And that's going to give you plenty of time to try Surfshark VPN out for yourself, risk-free. All you have to do is go to surfshark.deal/stephanieharlowe and use code stephanieharlowe to get 83% off a 2-year plan plus 3 extra months for free. This special offer makes your subscription just $2.21 a month. Once again, go to surfshark.deals/stephanieharlowe and use code stephanieharlowe to get 83% off a 2-year subscription plus 3 extra months for free. Thank you so much to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring today's video, and let's dive in. Todd Dombrowski's fall into the sinkhole was scary. I mean, Todd himself said that for a long time, he was traumatized by this. He couldn't even sleep in his own bed. He was just terrified. He kept reliving himself falling into that mine or into that hole over a mine over and over again. And they actually measured the level of carbon monoxide that was coming out of the hole that Todd had fallen into. And the official said that if he'd been in there for much longer, I mean, not even a lot longer, but just maybe another 30, 45 seconds, he would have gotten carbon monoxide poisoning and he would have died. As it was, he had to be rushed to the hospital and he had to be put on oxygen.
They administered oxygen. They rushed me to the hospital for some blood gas tests. I was just covered in mud. From the intense heat, I had heavy pants, heavy shirt, a heavy coat. It was baked on. I mean, you couldn't go to a car wash and blast me off. It was just baked on.
If he did not hold on to those roots, he would have slid down a gangway or down the slope, which was about 300 feet in depth. And if I recall, the temperatures recorded were anywhere from 400 to 600 degrees at the bottom of the hole.
So obviously the fact that Todd fell into this hole, it's very unfortunate, but the timing could not have been more perfect. Earlier that month, another Centralia resident named Tony Andrade, who was retired and living on disability, as well as his wife and his children, they were told that their house on South Locust Avenue was uninhabitable due to the dangerous concentrations of mine fire gases that had been making them sick. The Andrade family were not told this in person. They weren't offered help moving or finding a new place to live. They weren't given financial compensation. They weren't given an explanation of how they were supposed to sell this house in order to get money to relocate now that this house was uninhabitable because of toxic gases. They were simply sent a notice in the mail. And initially, Tony was overwhelmed by confusion and fear because he still had a mortgage on this house, and he couldn't afford to pay for 2 places to live on his meager income. The Andrade home was the third in Centralia to get this notice, but understand that these people were not getting any assistance from their local or state government. No offer of financial compensation, no offer of, help with relocation, nothing. I cannot make that clear enough, especially in the beginning. They were basically told, you shouldn't live here. It's not safe for you. And good luck.
I feel like I'm not part of America anymore. The way the government treats us, they treat us like cattle. And maybe not that good. I said, I wish some of those officials had come here and really live here for a year. Just take our place just for 1 year, and then they know what it's like to live like this.
However, there were some people who cared. There were some people who helped to make the Centralia problem more of a problem for the people who could actually do something about it. And just to name one person, DeWitt Smith. He was the director of PEMA, the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, and he actually came across a memo from the health department about what was going on in Centralia. And this memo actually told him, listen, you're going to hear about this thing, but you stay away from this, because we don't want to take any responsibility for it, right? That's the thing about Centralia. Somebody did this, somebody's to blame, but nobody really knows who to blame at this point. But they know somebody is to blame and somebody should be fixing it, so nobody wanted to really kind of take any responsibility. And this man, DeWitt Smith, he'd served during World War II in the Army, and he was one of those no troll left behind kind of military guys who would become one of the heroes that the people of Centralia desperately needed. Now, on February 14th, a group of important and influential people, from congressmen to state senators, they were all gathered in Centralia to investigate the problem for themselves. February 14th was the same day that Todd Dombrowski fell into that sinkhole that just appeared underneath him. So just as this group of really important and influential people were leaving Tony Andrade's home, the panicked 12-year-old boy covered in mud that was still warm from the sinkhole ran up to them breathless and told them, listen, I was just sucked into the earth, right? So everybody rushes over to his grandmother's backyard, Todd Dombrowski's grandmother's backyard, and the officials set up a barricade around the large steaming hole, and they discovered from old mine maps that there had once been a sloping mine shaft underneath Todd Dombrowski's grandmother's yard. The shaft had been filled with dirt and sediment, which had kept it stable, but gradually hot steam from the mine fire had caused the dirt to become moist, soft, and weak until it could no longer even hold up its own weight, causing it to collapse inward, taking Todd Dombrowski with it. This incident gave the state of Pennsylvania and the State Department no choice but to take what was happening in Centralia seriously for once. They could no longer ignore it. The governor at that time, Dick Thornburgh, put DeWitt Smith at the head of a task force made up of state and federal officials and ordered Smith to conduct a study of the mine fire. Another study, right? Because there's studies after studies happening in Centralia, borehole studies and studies to see if these ash barriers were doing any good. It's just study after study. And this is something that the residents really complained about, that it seemed like the people in charge were very much studying the problem, but not doing anything to fix the problem.
But this is a borehole project, sir, will not protect us. We need, first of all, in many of our mines, a reinforcement of the existing fly ash barriers. And this settlement of the barriers is what's causing this gas situation that we have in town, and the steam. And we implore you to look into this.
Well, it certainly will be one of the considerations that will be given once we have gathered the information from this drilling program.
As I sit here and listen, it comes to my mind, why will it be a full year of monitoring the borehole project? Is it going to be a full year and then a decision made? Or is there going to be something done in between that? Or are they going to wait? And why would it take a full year?
So DeWitt Smith actually took this assignment very seriously, and he was in Centralia by February 19th. Now, the story goes that as Smith's car rounded the last curve on Route 61 before Centralia, and he saw steam rising from the ground at the side of the highway, he remarked of how it reminded him of a poor man's Dante Inferno. Now, let me describe for you the kind of town that DeWitt Smith walked into. What was the state of Centralia, Pennsylvania like by mid-February of 1981? Let me first explain to you the canary in a coal mine tradition. This is a tradition that dated back to 1911 and it continued on until 1986. So canaries, like other birds, are very good early detectors of carbon monoxide because they're vulnerable to airborne poisons, because they need such immense quantities of oxygen to enable them to fly, and to fly at heights that would make humans' altitude sick. The canary's anatomy allows them to get a dose of oxygen when they inhale and another when they exhale by holding air in their extra sacs. So this is why miners would start bringing canaries in cages down in the coal mines with them, because if the canary died from carbon monoxide poisoning, it would still give the humans enough time to get out before they were affected by the carbon monoxide poisoning. And as I explained in part 1 of this series, they did this, or they felt that they had to do this, because carbon monoxide is very hard to detect. It's almost undetectable. It doesn't have any color. It's odorless. You really only know that you're being poisoned by carbon monoxide when you start to feel the effects. So in Centralia, for a while, this place in town called Lou's Barbershop, it used to sell canaries to residents so that they would be alerted to the poisonous gases in their homes. But by 1981, there was no longer a purpose in stocking these birds because they were literally dropping like flies. There was so much carbon monoxide, and canaries are so sensitive to carbon monoxide that they just couldn't keep the canaries alive. The canaries were replaced by actual electronic carbon monoxide detectors, and most of the homes on Locust Street and Wood Street had the carbon monoxide detectors inside of their homes. But even then, people were saying it was just constant. The carbon monoxide detectors were going off all the time, constantly, to the point where they would just open their windows and let the house air out, but the carbon monoxide detectors would still be going off even with the windows open, and people would just start getting used to it. Even in the middle of the night when the thing would start clanging without a warning and wake everyone up. People were getting sick, but worse than that, they were watching their young children become ill as well. In January and February of 1981, the gas alarm at the St. Ignatius School went off 19 times. 9-year-old Rachel Lamb was forced to sleep with an oxygen machine every night. 5-year-old Shannon Buckley had to be hospitalized due to respiratory issues so many times during the fall of 1980 that the doctor's only advice to her parents was that Shannon needed to be removed from her home for at least a week so that her body could start taking oxygen in again.
When I was expecting Angelique about, I guess, a year ago, a doctor came to Centralia, and at a town meeting he warned us that there could be possible birth defects from the carbon monoxide gas and the carbon dioxide and low levels of oxygen. And he warned that pregnant mothers should leave town and that the woman here shouldn't have any children at all. And he also said that the first 3 months were the most dangerous time. I was already 6 months pregnant, so it was too late to leave, and it was really scary. And then after Angelique was born, she was perfectly healthy, so I was really happy. And we had a good summer here with her and Katrina, and it was really just nice. And then fall came and winter, and we had to close the windows, and the carbon monoxide gases, they built up in the house. The levels got higher and higher. And Angelique one day came down with a cold, and she just seemed like she never got better. She got progressively worse and worse. Her eyes started to water, and she had a runny nose, a cough all the time, a really deep and severe cough. It wasn't, just once in a while. And then she got to the point where during the night she would just wake up and vomit all the time. It was really sad. It was frightening for us. So we went to our pediatrician, and he thought that the causes could have been related to the carbon monoxide. So at that time, we took it upon ourselves and we moved out of our home.
The Buckleys are one of 27 families who lost their home to the mine fire. Both Mrs. Buckley and her daughter Shannon suffered chronic respiratory ailments, which they blame in part on the gases in their home.
Yeah, at the beginning, I sort of had to take the factors of my family's health. And it really broke my heart and kill me to give up my home. But when it comes between my home and my family, I had to have a choice there. So I did move. That's the only reason I did move. If I was there myself, I'd have never moved. I'd still be there. I'd never move.
Residents described constantly feeling sick to their stomachs, sitting down to watch a television program only to wake up and find that hours had passed. They were having headaches, burning and watering eyes, a constant state of feeling unwell and just off, just ill. On March 10th, another sinkhole opened up in the backyard of a woman who was just feet away pruning her garden. And the mayor of Centralia started warning people to stay out of their yards and to keep an eye on the ground while they were walking around town, which is bananas to me, right? Like you own your home and you live there, but you shouldn't go into your yard because a hole might open up underneath you. On March 19th, 1981, the townspeople gathered outside in the cold and watched as 61-year-old John Coddington was removed from his home on a stretcher and rushed to the hospital after he had fallen asleep and not woken up. Now remember that John Coddington had the only gas station in town, and it had recently been shut down because the gas tanks holding gasoline underneath his service station were getting so hot because of the underground fire, so they had to drain them so that they wouldn't explode. But John Coddington and his family still lived in the upper apartment over the garage. They still lived there. And the levels of carbon monoxide in that area, in John Coddington's home especially, were so high that they were all constantly just passing out. And it just kind of became a part of life, something that they kind of accepted. That they had these headaches, that they, sometimes fell into such a deep sleep, they had to be shaken awake. And John Coddington said it was annoying, if anything, because he would sit down to watch the evening news, and within minutes he would just pass out, and then he'd wake up hours later and he just didn't know what happened on the news. So this actually happened again on March 19th. John Coddington went to bed and he didn't wake up. And actually the only reason anybody knew that something was wrong with him was because he passed out to the point where he rolled off his bed and fell out of bed, and he still didn't wake up. So his wife, Isabel, she called the hospital. And later Isabel would be told, if your husband didn't pass out and fall out of bed, all of you would not have woken up the next morning. Your husband, yourself, your kids, you just would have died in the night. Now, John Coddington would eventually come to once he was given oxygen, but Centralia had now watched the mine fire almost claim another life. The air in the Coddington home was tested and found to be 100 parts per million, the highest possible reading on the dial. So it's likely that the carbon monoxide levels were even higher than that. And the corresponding tape that comes out of the machine, it showed that the gas had remained for 42 minutes, which is an incredibly long time. Every single day, these gas inspectors made their way to 15 homes in the mine fire impact zone, which is the area of Centralia that had been the most affected. And the inspectors would go in, they'd check the air quality, they'd perform several tests, make sure that at least in that moment, everything was okay. But most people, including the inspectors, understood that this didn't mitigate the risk of being affected by carbon monoxide poisoning at all. It really didn't, because toxic gas readings in this area could go from safe to lethal in minutes.
They come in and test every day, every room in the house. We have no more privacy. Our privacy is gone. Our life is a daily open book. My daughter can't sleep in her bedroom because there are readings of high gas up in her bedroom. And she's been getting sick, so we have her sleeping downstairs. It's a nightmare living like that. It's really a nightmare.
Once a tight-knit community of individuals who could trace their roots back to the early days of Irish immigrants settling in the area to escape the potato famine, Centralia now became a town divided.
Is there a danger? I mean, the fact that the temperatures are so high over there, is there a danger?
There's a danger in certain parts, yes. Certain parts. The biggest danger, I guess, would be from the gases coming up, But how much, See, is it enough to injure anybody, to kill them, or put them in a house? We actually don't know.
For one thing, there are two parts of Centralia. There's an impact zone, and that zone is where people are most affected by the gases and by the subsidence. The other part of town is the so-called safe part of town. There are no gases coming up through the ground in the homes. So people are divided on that factor. They feel safe, we don't, because we live in the impact zone.
According to the book Unseen Danger, quote, "The Centralia story is one of residents who lost faith in government and each other. It's the story of an ecological disaster that stripped away the facade of community to reveal a segmented, uncoordinated collective that was ill-prepared to unite in the interest of the town as a whole." End quote. This book goes on to explain that unlike the social structures in other areas hit by natural disasters, such as hurricanes or earthquakes, in this situation with Centralia, it wasn't really a natural disaster at all. I mean, it dealt with natural forces, but it wasn't one of those act of God natural disasters. Here, there was someone to blame. In the case of most natural disasters, there's usually a warning that something is about to happen. You know, you have weather alerts to say, hey, a hurricane's coming, or you have, certain readings that let you know the earth is a-shaking and an earthquake's going to be on its way shortly. And then once you have that warning and you're allowed to prepare a little bit, then the destruction happens. And then the community comes together to take in the damage, grieve, and start rebuilding together. No one can be blamed, right, in those situations. No one's expected to stop an earthquake or prevent a tsunami. And this shared traumatic experience creates new bonds and brings people closer together. Whereas with the mine fire in Centralia, this was caused by humans, but who do you blame in that situation? Do you blame the mining companies that came in the 1800s? Do you blame the miners who went in and did bootleg mining and kind of screwed everything up? Do you blame the council in Centralia in 1962 that made the decision to set that fire to begin with? Do you blame the state and federal representatives who turned a blind eye to it afterwards and didn't help? And this just causes anger and resentment because there are so many people to blame, and yet nobody wanted to take any responsibility. And of course, it's a financial thing as well, right? Relief money from state and federal government is often offered for these natural disasters like hurricanes and things, whereas in Centralia, government officials continually passed the buck. The fire wasn't an act of God. It was the physical representation of human greed and ignorance, and honestly, a little bit of irresponsibility, right? Someone had started it, someone was responsible, and that person or persons should pay to fix the problem. And while everyone pointed fingers and looked around for who to blame, the fire continued to blaze unchecked until it became unstoppable. And it also didn't help that the force destroying the town raged underground unseen. If the fire had been at the surface, or if the poisonous gases that it produced had been more tangible, more easy to see in the air around you, maybe some residents would have felt a greater sense of danger and a greater urgency to leave. But so many people living in Centralia, if they weren't directly affected by what the fire was doing, they didn't really believe it was as big of a deal as the people who were actually living in the mine fire affected areas. And you also have to understand, for over 20 years, every single government official that visited Centralia or spoke about the mine fire, they minimized its impact and danger because no one wanted to be the first person to acknowledge that there was a problem. I mean, imagine, right? Imagine this on a smaller scale for your life. Imagine you're in your house. It's been a long day. Maybe you work at a restaurant. You didn't get home until 2 a.m. And you walk inside and you just want to, brush your teeth, wash your face, and go to bed. You're finally ready to just call it a night. And then you see that some raccoons got into your trash cans outside, and now there's garbage all over your yard and driveway. Now, you might just go to bed. You might just go to bed and pretend you hadn't seen it. You might let your husband wake up the next morning and think that he was the first one to notice and acknowledge the mess, so that he's the one that cleans it up. I'm not saying that I've ever done anything like that before. I'm just saying it's like a good example of what happened in Centralia. There were a good amount of Centralia residents, especially the older ones whose families had lived there for generations, who didn't want to leave the homes and the lives that they'd been building for decades, even longer. than decades sometimes. Maybe it was their father's home or their father's father's home. And these people sort of turned on the people who were heavily affected, the people who were living directly in that kind of Locust Avenue and Wood Road area, the people who had young children that they were worried about, and the people who were constantly demanding officials to do something to fix the problem. And I suppose the psychology of this is, if the older people, the ones who wanted to stay and have life go on as it always had, if they could just pretend that everyone else was overreacting and there's nothing going on, maybe nothing would change for them. Quote, in a community where 47% of the residents had lived in their homes 25 years or longer, the threat to community existence was met with dread and anger toward neighbors who had, from the longer timers' perspective, clearly misjudged the seriousness of the problem. Many Centralians who saw the high-risk believers as themselves a peril to the community began to organize to save their town, end quote. So the town sort of splitting in two, it kind of caused an us versus them feeling. It created two ideologies that could not exist at the same time in the same place. The concern for health and safety and the desire to save and preserve Centralia exactly as it always had been for all of time. So there were two factions, essentially. There was the Concerned Citizens Action Group against the Centralia fire, led by a man named John Lamb and supported by those who lived in the fire hot zones, those who were the most affected. And then there was another faction that didn't really have a name, but let's call them the Molly Maguires 2.0. And this faction was led by a man named John Koshoff, who'd been elected president of the Centralia Council in early 1982, and whose father, John Koshoff Sr., had actually been the secretary of the Centralia Council in 1962 when they had made the fateful decision to set the dump fire that had caused all of these problems. So Koshoff's main priority was to keep as much of Centralia intact as possible, which meant he viewed anyone who was in support of relocation as an enemy. So he and his group employed some threatening and scary tactics to let the enemy know that basically they should stop doing what they were doing. They should stop trying to get the government to help and come in and change Centralia, or else. John Koshoff, along with several of his supporters that included his younger sister Helen, who was a lawyer, the Wolmers, and the mayor of the town, actually, John Wondolowski, was also a supporter of John Koshoff. They did not, any of them, live in the affected areas of Centralia, and they openly attacked those who did. During one council meeting, Helen Koshoff attacked a woman named Joan Girolami, who supported relocation for those affected by the deadly mine gases. And Helen cruelly accused Joan of basically causing problems where there were none. And she claimed that Joan didn't have any proof that anyone in the town was in danger. And this might once again be strange to you. You might say, how could anybody feel this way? It's been 20 years. We're talking about the 80s now. The fire started in 1962. People are sick. People are getting sick. There's proof and evidence that there's a fire burning underneath the town, and there's proof and evidence that there's deadly carbon monoxide in the air. But so many people turned a blind eye to that.
John Wondolowski, the part-time mayor of the town who operates a bulldozer at a strip mine just outside of Centralia, does not believe his community is in imminent danger. He is not without his critics and his supporters.
Well, the mine fire is extensive, but in my own personal opinion, I think it's moving away from the town. From my experience, I feel that some of the boreholes that were checked up there, the temperature's been going steadily down. The fire, I think, is east of town. I don't think it's really under the borough of Centralia.
To say that you have fire under the whole borough, no, I don't think this is true at all. I'm even doubtful if we actually have fire under the borough itself. I know we have a lot of heat, a lot of gas on our southeastern end of town.
We do have a few problems, but I think raising a family in this environment is great as far as I'm concerned.
Every night and day, members of the Concerned Citizens Group received harassing and threatening phone calls, including death threats. David Lamb received a call telling him that if he wanted to relocate out of Centralia so bad, he would never leave the town alive. And it's only slightly ironic that many of the residents who were taking part in these intimidation tactics were descendants of the Molly Maguires, who were also known to take part in, some activities that are a little controversial to get their own way. But it wasn't really fair because John Koshoff and his little posse, they just didn't seem to either want to accept or care how bad it was for the people living in the hot zone. 67-year-old Agnes Owens lived on East Street, where boreholes drilled would show 580-degree temperatures right outside her front door, and her carbon monoxide alarm was going off several times a day, every single day, to the point where Agnes would just pass out and then come to later when the toxic gases subsided, and that was just kind of like her life. And officials actually thought that her gas monitor was defective, so they swapped it out for a new one. That was their solution to it, like, oh, your gas monitor must not be working correctly because it's going off too much, so let's get you a new one. And when that one kept going off too, the Molly Maguire's 2.0 of Centralia told everyone that Agnes was crazy. They did fail to mention that at one point the ground under her house was 700 degrees and rising. In 1982, the U.S. Office of Surface Mining completed a borehole study that cost $850,000. This was a study, okay? $850,000. This wasn't like a solution. This wasn't a project that was going to stop the fire or make the gases subside. It was just a study to drill a bunch of boreholes in an effort to see if they could determine the exact location of the underground fire, which would then help them figure out what steps could be taken to start solving the problem. And what they would discover from this study was that it was an almost $700 million fix. $700 million would be needed to even start to fix the problem of the fire. And it was so hard to get that $850,000 for the borehole study. The people in Centralia, like the officials in Centralia and in the state of Pennsylvania, they knew they couldn't afford it, $700 million for a small town like that. And they knew that the federal government wouldn't give them the money that would be needed to save this town. And that was kind of the turning point. It usually is when it's just going to be too much money. People just don't want to do anything about it. They don't have the money. They don't know how to raise it. They don't know where to get it from. It's kind of like if you get frostbite on your arm and your whole hand is like black from the frostbite. You can't save your hand. You can't get it back. So you got to cut it off to prevent that frostbite from spreading to the healthy tissue. And that's where the minds of the officials at this time were. Like, we have to cut this off. We got to completely take Centralia out of the picture, like pull it to the ground, completely demolish it, and hopefully try to figure out a way to stop the fire from spreading to outside areas, to other towns, because this fire is going to keep going and it's going to keep burning. At the end of 1982, the town panicked when they realized the fire was getting closer and closer to Highway 61, and that meant that it was getting closer to the natural gas pipeline that ran parallel to Highway 61. The one that was actually built in the 60s after the fire had started. And the company who built that natural gas pipeline, they were like, don't worry about the fire. The fire's like over there. The fire's not going to come over here. And even if it does, these underground pipelines can withstand a lot of heat. Not the kind of heat that fire was bringing, right? So obviously this is an issue now because we don't want the fire under Highway 61. You don't want sinkholes when, people are driving down the road, and you don't want the fire to ignite the natural gas pipeline. In the book Fire Underground, the author writes, quote, moving along the Buck Vein on the Burnsville side of the mountain, the fire was advancing several feet a day, the speed of light in mine fire terms. Here, on the south side, where the mine support pillars were intact and the way mostly clear, the fire could move much faster than on the Centralia side, where the fire had to pick its way through much collapsed roof rock, end quote. This was obviously dangerous for many reasons, and officials were concerned about sinkholes just appearing under vehicles or school buses driving down the highway. And temperatures under the highway in December of 1982 had been 149 degrees. By January 5th, 1983, just 3 weeks later, temperatures had reached 770 degrees, and there was real concern that the highway might collapse or the natural gas line might explode. The following weekend, a crack split open the southbound lanes of Highway 61, but still, the governor refused to declare a safety hazard, and the highway remained open. But the following week, heavy rainfall hit the now burning hot pavement, causing a fog that was so thick and soupy and dense that dangerous driving conditions were now an additional third concern. By March of 1983, nearly 36 families had been forced to leave their homes, and parts of Highway 61 were permanently closed. And eventually, that area of Highway 61, which is just under a mile, it would be closed permanently, and the highway would be rerouted around Centralia, which is part of the whole plan of basically acting like Centralia doesn't exist and never existed, to the point where you can't drive up to Centralia on the highway. You'd have to kind of go down that closed portion of the highway. So if you weren't going to do that, you would never even know that Centralia existed. And as the months passed, it became very clear to most people that Centralia was doomed. And the main objective now was to just prevent the fire from spreading to neighboring towns. At least that was in the government's mind, the officials. They weren't really telling that to everyone living there. The officials and the government were planning things for Centralia years before they were open about what they were planning with the people that lived there. But one of the plans was to dig a 500-foot trench around the entire town. But this came along with the understanding that it would mean residents would be required to abandon their homes and evacuate. And this is when many people started to believe that they were the victims of a government and big business conspiracy at the highest levels. And honestly, I haven't even touched on the level of government corruption that this town had to deal with. The amount that was covered up while everyone from state to federal politicians looked the other way. There would be no way to cover all of that in these two videos. We'd have to talk about specifically that for over an hour. And I definitely suggest, if you're interested in this topic, you should read the book Fire Underground by, I think his name is David DeCock. It's a very good book, and it does go in depth into what the government was doing, what the politicians were doing, and what they weren't doing, and what they were saying to each other behind the scenes. And all of this stuff does add up, in my opinion, to a really big, level of corruption and a really big letdown of the people that these public servants are supposed to be serving. So I honestly can't really blame the residents of Centralia who felt that there was something nefarious happening under the surface, literally and figuratively. The people of Centralia had long believed that there was still a treasure trove of valuable anthracite coal laying beneath their feet, specifically in the Mammoth vein. And this vein of coal was named that because of how big it was, like how much coal it held, how much valuable anthracite coal it held. Centralia had owned the rights to its own coal since 1950, and this had been done specifically to prevent big mining companies from coming in and continuing their work, because Centralia was worried that more mine shafts and more digging would cause more safety and environmental issues. But it also meant that no one could dig up the coal under the town unless, of course, there was no town, meaning there was no one left there to lay claim to the financially beneficial assets beneath the ground. An article in May of 1974 seemed to be what planted the seeds of this conspiracy theory, when the article posed the question of whether or not the town of Centralia could be moved partially or completely, because the town itself was only worth about $1 million, but reportedly it sat in a basin of coal worth $25 million. And at that time, people lost their minds, right? John Coddington was actually the mayor in the 70s, and he presided over a town meeting where residents were livid at the suggestion that they would be shoved from their homes so that someone or many someones could come in and steal the coal and make a buck. Now, the way the conspiracy theory goes is that after the mine fire began in 1962, various government agencies, along with private businesses, conspired to get at the valuable anthracite coal. So they purposely failed again and again to put the fire out, hoping to eventually put the residents of Centralia in a position where they had no choice but to leave and abandon their homes and their town and their coal. This theory was further strengthened in the 80s when talks of relocation began, because at first, the governor and government agencies made it seem as if leaving Centralia was a choice. You don't have to leave, but if you don't feel safe, you can leave. Or if you're not in an area of the town affected by the mine fire, you don't have to leave. Many people did leave, of course, but some of them stayed, believing that they were doing the equivalent of chaining themselves to a giant redwood tree that was at risk of being chopped down. Literally, they were putting themselves between the coal and whoever wanted it, aka the greedy government. Some people even believed that the council had set the fire on purpose in 1962 for the specific reason, like they were getting paid off. And if they helped the big guy get at the coal that was under Centralia, these people would be paid off who were on the council. So at first, it was a voluntary thing. At first, the governor was like, you can leave if you want, but you don't have to leave if you don't want. Like, this is your home. We understand. But as time went on, it started to become less of a voluntary thing and more of like a mandatory thing. And that's when people got a little bit like sensitive about it. On November 19th, 1983, Congress passed a $42 million appropriation bill to help relocate families who wanted to leave town because they no longer felt safe in their own homes. Between 1985 and 1991, 545 homes and businesses were acquired by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. But of course, the plan was to acquire these homes and then simply condemn and then level the buildings and the homes to the ground. And the people who had lived in those homes, it was not a super great situation for them because they didn't really have a choice. They had to leave because it wasn't safe, but they weren't given fair prices for their homes by Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania bought the houses, but they didn't give people anywhere close to what the homes would have been worth if they hadn't been sitting on top of ground where there was a mine fire raging below.
When the time came, we saw that what we were getting for the home was $11,000, which people thought we were getting a lot of money. It was supposed to be, it's worth $36,000, but we were offered $11,000 for it. They took off depreciation for this and that, and you ended up with that, and you took it or you stayed there. And we definitely couldn't stay. We worked so hard. We went through so much in that home. All our memories are there. The first hardest years of our marriage were there, and it'll never be the same no matter where we go, whether it was Bloomsburg or another community.
House after house fell to the ground, and by the fall of 1986, less than 50 structures remained standing in Centralia. But it was all done under the guise of relocation being voluntary, unless you were a renter, of course, and then you didn't have a choice, which was the sad reality for John and Bertha Marinick, a couple in their 60s who had been renting a house at 420 West Center Street in the area of Centralia that hadn't been affected by the fire yet. When their landlord sold the house to the Redevelopment Authority in October of 1985, John and Bertha were told that they would need to find another place to live. But of course, they didn't really want to leave, especially Bertha, who'd been born in Centralia. She'd been raised there. Her family had owned a grocery store there in the 1930s. Her husband, John, had worked in the mines of Centralia until he had a stroke in his 50s and he had to stop working. Bertha really didn't want to leave. And at first, John, her husband, didn't want to leave either. But eventually, John would give in to the reality that they would just have to move. However, Bertha was less willing to accept it, and the couple began arguing heatedly for months, with their arguments intensifying as pressure came from the Columbia County Redevelopment Authority, who had sent an eviction notice to the Marinicks on May 12, 1987, giving them 90 days to vacate. That 90 days expired on August 12th, but John and Bertha stayed. They were actually only one of two couples who had not made other living arrangements who had received these eviction notices. Neighbors often heard the two arguing, and on October 6, 1987, during an alcohol-fueled fight, John stabbed his wife Bertha to death in the house that they were being forced to leave. Realizing what he had done, John got in his car and drove out to the Badlands that surrounded the town. He parked, poured gasoline on himself, and lit a match, dying in a fiery blaze. It was really sad. And you'd think the government officials who'd been forcing these people out of their homes would have felt bad, and some of them did. But one of them, I forget his name. I think it was Click. His last name was Click, and he was the head of the redevelopment authority. He was like, I feel bad that they died, but what do you want me to do? They had plenty of time. We told them they had to leave. This was my job. I was tasked with making sure that these residents left Centralia. That was my job, and I did it. What do you want me to do? He was kind of a dick about it. The mine fire continued to move throughout Centralia all through the 80s, even as the town emptied out. And by the end of the decade, it was now encroaching areas that had previously been considered safe, areas where the town's most stubborn residents continued to live despite multiple sinkholes popping up and deep cracks in the pavement stretching out within just feet of their front doors. A large sinkhole was complicated when a water main began leaking into the hole, and once combined with the fire inside, the water created vast amounts of billowing steam that was just loaded with carbon monoxide, right? They describe it as being rich in carbon monoxide, but that sounds like a good thing. This steam that was coming out of the sinkhole was basically just vaporized carbon monoxide. The residents who stayed, the ones who firmly believed there was no danger, and this was all an effort to steal the coal, they were more concerned that their hometown had now become a morbid tourist attraction. They were far more concerned with people just popping up and taking pictures and asking questions than they were with the poison venting into the air outside their open windows. A woman named Mary Lou Gaunan told a reporter, quote, "Florida, Iowa, Wisconsin, they want to see the fire burn. They want to see glow. They want to see flames," end quote. And if people came around that time, they would see that. You could look out into the Badlands and you could see the earth glowing from within. You know, kind of the way when you have a fire and the wood on top of the fire is kind of burned out and it's all charred and it's not really ignited anymore, but right underneath you can see the glowing embers that are there. That's what it looked like. And, admittedly, it looked really cool at night, but not if you lived there. Not if you were trying to pretend that everything was fine and nothing was wrong, and you were going to continue living in this town that was being consumed by flames. Now, the Office of Surface Mining, they tried to fix that sinkhole by drilling some more boreholes and backfilling the underground holes, but all of their efforts seemed to only make things worse, especially the backfilling, which somehow gave birth to more sinkholes. And this just caused the remaining residents to accuse the OSM of purposely making things worse to chase them out again. In 1980, Centralia held 1,017 people. By 1990, only 63 remained. And although those 63 people suspected the government was trying to force them out, they didn't even know the half of it. They didn't know what was going on behind the scenes. Governor Dick Thornburgh had promised these residents that they could stay, that nobody was going to try to make them leave their homes. But behind the scenes, there was a lot happening. A new governor took office, and several organizations were pushing for eminent domain. Eminent domain is the right of a government or its agents to seize private property for public use without the owner's consent. A man named Jack Carling, who was managing the Centralia relocation program on behalf of the Pennsylvania Department of Community Affairs, he just could not understand why they were just allowing people to stay there in Centralia when it was truly dangerous. And then Bill Klink, the executive director of the Columbia County Housing and Redevelopment Authority, he gave an interview to the Reading Eagle in 1991, and his words really did drip with contempt when he claimed that the rational people of Centralia had enough sense to leave long ago, and the ones who remained were too ignorant or too blind to feel fear. Klink said, quote, "There is real danger here. There are houses in town I wouldn't sleep in for one night." End quote. The holdouts in Centralia gave their own interviews, scoffing at assertions made by Klink and Carling that the town was not safe. Lana Mervine told the Chicago Tribune, Look around you. It's ridiculous. We're in no danger. Everything's great here." And her husband, Lamar Mervine, who had started acting as the mayor of whatever was left of Centralia, he said, quote, "We don't have guns or we'd be like Waco. We're going to fight right down to the end." End quote. In early February of 1992, the remaining residents were sent a message that the end may be closer than they thought, and they all started receiving notices of eminent domain in their mailboxes. They tried fighting, they filed lawsuits, they wrote letters, they stayed put, but one by one, most of the remaining residents would leave Centralia, Pennsylvania behind. But not all of them. In 1993, Highway 61 was closed and rerouted completely, and a section of that road would become known as Graffiti Highway because after years of being left alone, it was transformed into a colorful canvas for local artists. By 2013, the cracked and bubbled asphalt canvas was a rainbow of vibrant graffiti, all sorts of cool things. People would write their names, people would make beautiful pictures, people would draw penises, whatever makes them happy. But in 2020, when the Graffiti Highway began drawing even more visitors due to people being locked away during the pandemic, the decision was made to basically remove the appeal of the highway. And, I understand and it makes sense because there are still people living in this town, right? And apparently the residents that were left, which is just 5 people, they said that these tourists were coming and they were being kind of rude, disrespectful, walking around the town like there weren't people there. And I mean, you look at these different news articles and you look at these different blogs about Centralia, and they do call it a ghost town, but it's not technically a ghost town because there's people living there still. It is still private property. I mean, I guess that's not completely true. It's not technically private property, I think, because even the homes of the 5 people who remain, the government did take eminent domain of their houses, but they just basically said, you can stay here as long as you want, like even though we took eminent domain, like you can stay here and live out your lives here, but once you die or leave, then we're completely going to just demolish your house and raze it to the ground. But even so, those people don't want these tourists coming in, being all looky-loos, taking weird pictures that are insensitive, and leaving trash and garbage and litter all over the place. And this especially became an issue during the pandemic. We saw a lot of this, that people were so stir crazy being stuck in their house, and they had all of this time because no one was really working, that a lot of people kind of just went on these random road trips to like isolated areas. And what better thing to do when you're stuck in your house during a pandemic than to just take a road trip and explore some ghost towns? But Centralia wasn't actually a ghost town at this point. So the residents who remained, and even people in towns surrounding Centralia, they really wanted that graffiti highway covered up because it was bringing in a bunch of people, an element that they didn't want in their small and insular area. And according to Atlas Obscura, during the week of April 6th, 2020, a 3-day burial process took place, and a convoy of 400 dump trucks descended on the area, delivering between 8,000 and 10,000 tons of dirt, which was piled on top of the colorful concrete. Now, to this day, old Highway 61 is still covered with this dirt, but it still does crack open and spew smoke and fumes into the air from time to time. Although it's less colorful, the area still attracts tourists who should be careful if they go there, right? If you're planning on visiting Centralia, that's fine as long as you're respectful, as long as you keep your distance, as long as you don't act like a dick and leave your litter there. I want to eventually go there myself and check it out just because, I live in New York, Pennsylvania's not far. But if you are planning to go there, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection has strongly warned anyone who's visiting the area of the danger due to the presence of dangerous gases and the strong possibility of sinkholes appearing beneath their feet. So if you go there, be careful, keep an eye out for that stuff, and just understand that there are risks, just like there's risks in visiting Chernobyl and things like that. There are still risks to your health. In 1991, one of the holdout residents, Mary Lou Gonin, had described Centralia as God's little heaven. She told one paper, quote, 17927, God's little heaven, end quote. And 17927 was Centralia's zip code, but in 2002, the U.S. Postal Service discontinued it. And as of 2012, the mine fire involved about 400 surface acres and was growing at a rate of 50 to 75 feet a year. If you visited Centralia today, you would have a hard time finding it because it no longer looks like a town with paved streets and sturdy homes. Most of it's become overgrown, and if not for the signs that are posted warning visitors to proceed with caution, you wouldn't really even know that anything had stood there at all in a lot of places in town. I mean, that's dramatic. There are a few structures left standing. There's the church, there's a few houses because, like I said, believe it or not, 5 people still live in Centralia, the last of the holdouts, if you will, and 4 of them are members of the Centralia Council. And each month they get together, they pay the town's bills, and they keep its government functioning. They are there to, as they say, keep Centralia on the map, which I kind of love. They understand the risks. They've been warned of the risks, at least, and they are there to just keep their town on the map because they know once they leave, it's over. Like I said, they've already rerouted Highway 61 so that, it doesn't even go near Centralia. They've now poured tons and tons of dirt on old Highway 61. They've completely demolished most of the houses and businesses in town to the point where vegetation has grown over it. When these 5 people are gone, they're going to just tear down their houses and it's going to be nothing. There's going to be nothing there. It's going to be as if Centralia never existed. And imagine that you're so tied to this place through your history, through your ancestors, and you think one day this just isn't going to be here anymore. I'm the one keeping it alive now. I completely understand why they're so attached to the area, even though there's not much there at this point. So was there a conspiracy to steal the coal from underneath the town? Was there a carefully laid plan that would have worked if not for those pesky kids, aka the 5 people who have refused to leave? According to author David DeCock, the motive, which would have been financial, it doesn't really add up. Even if there is a wealth of anthracite coal beneath Centralia, which I do believe there really isn't that big of a market for anthracite coal at this point. In his book, Fire Underground, DeCock writes, quote, anthracite production in Pennsylvania peaked at 99.7 million tons in 1917 and began a relatively steady decline as the nation switched to other, more convenient fuels, namely heating oil and natural gas. Even in 1950, some 44.1 million tons of anthracite were still pulled out of mines in the state, but by 1974, only 6.6 million tons were produced. In 2006, the total had declined to 1.5 million tons, enough to fuel the remaining homes that used anthracite for heat, plus a few bakeries and pizza ovens in New York City, end quote. And I mean, at this point, besides Pennsylvania and, some very small parts of the U.S., most of the anthracite coal is coming from China. So anybody who needs anthracite coal at this point can get it cheaper from China. Like everything else, That is something else that knowing a lot about history has taught me. The second we started moving industry out of the United States, we screwed ourselves. We put people out of jobs in an effort to get something for cheaper than we could make it here, which doesn't make any sense because obviously having jobs and having a thriving industry in the United States is more important than saving a couple bucks here and there and having to import things in. But that's where we're at now. So what David DeCock is basically saying is there's probably a ton of anthracite coal underneath Centralia, but who wants it? Nobody really wants it. It's an expensive type of coal. Nobody's really using coal anymore. And if they wanted it, they could just get it from China for cheaper. So probably there wasn't a conspiracy. But I also think sometimes people come up with a conspiracy to just make themselves feel better about the fact that they're afraid of something, right? I think a lot of these residents were afraid to leave the only place they had ever known. I think a lot of them were afraid to cut themselves off from their history and their ancestors. And I think that it was easier for them to say, oh, we're victims and we're fighting the big guy. We're little guys fighting the big guy than it was to say, we're just afraid. We're afraid of change. We're afraid to go someplace new. We're afraid to see what else is out there when we're perfectly happy with what we have here. And I think that happens a lot in humanity and in life. And people should be more understanding of that when, others come up with what they believe to be bizarre conspiracy theories. Either one, you should acknowledge that the conspiracy theory might be true. There's always that possibility. Or two, you have to really consider and think where is this coming from? What is this person feeling that they're not showing me that might be fueling the fire of this conspiracy theory? But that's pretty much where we're at now. We got 5 people living in Centralia. We got people still going there for a tourist attraction, even though each year there's less there to see. And we have, I guess, a huge issue with the fire still burning and really nobody to blame. There's lots of people to blame, but there's nobody to blame who can fix it. So trying to find someone to blame is counterproductive at this point. And I think it's just a very interesting story, but also a very sad story of this vivid part of Pennsylvania and United States history that is being snuffed out, basically being eaten alive by this fire. And the people who lived there had to just accept that. There wasn't anything that they could do about it. And that's sad because imagine it's you, it's your community, it's your home. And you're so attached to it and you love it and it's all you know. And all of a sudden somebody tells you you have to leave. And you don't have a choice. And it's very sad. So it's an interesting story. It's a fascinating story, but it's also a story about humans. It's a human interest piece, right? It's a story about people who we may not understand their motives, but we can understand their connection to their past, their traditions, and their history. And we can understand how it might feel jarring and almost impossible to let go of that. I hope we can, at least. So that's all I have for you today. Let me know what you think about Centralia in the comment section of this video. Like the video if you liked it. Share it if you think it's worth sharing. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Stay kind, stay beautiful, and stay safe. And I will see you very, very soon. Bye.
Straight down, and that river runs deep. The mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name. Better say a Hail Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's getting you slowly. It's all you got to let it go. I got blood blood on the strings.